Okay, so I'm gonna forego the usual intro. This just seems a bit too serious and sober topic for it. This is gonna be a heavy one, but it needs to be said. Some people are probably gonna look at this and go, "What the hell are you talking about? I've never heard of this before. That's not true, etc." And I expect that because when it comes to a topic as heavy as the Holocaust, people generally have very limited understandings of it, shall we say. And the other thing that doesn't help is that the term Nazi has been thrown around so often that it's been heavily cheapened, and these days people will even insert Godwin's law and invoke it into a conversation, even when what you are talking about is the most solemn, accurate, and fair comparison to the Nazis possible. One that actually says never again means never again, and we should never go back to this. I digress. Um, what a lot of people tend to think when they think of the Holocaust is they think of the final solution. They think of 5.8 million Jews. It was, according to the way they think, it was the Jews first, then others, and that is inaccurate. In fact, it was those of us with a disability, and I'm on the ADD and autism spectrum for anyone who didn't know, who were the first to be rounded up and butchered by the Nazis in a collection of actions called the Nazi euthanasia program, as it has come to be known. But the official technical names were, I think it was Action T4 for the child genocide and Action 14 for the adult genocide. And both of these directly were the direct precursors of the final solution. And more than that, if you look at most aspects of the final solution, they have their origins in the Nazi euthanasia program. For example, the gas chambers. The Nazis originally tied 20 to 40 people with a disability like me up naked and blew them up with dynamite, but the Nazis decided that was too messy, and their solution was the gas chambers. People might want to bring up a sticking point of, yes, but those gas chambers used carbon monoxide, and in the final solution, they refined them to switch from carbon monoxide to Zyklon B, and that's true, but you're still talking about the notion of mass murder by gassing originating in the Nazi euthanasia program. When it comes to the experimentation, those brutal and sadistic experiments that the Nazis were infamous for performing on Jews. Well, those experiments were a carryover from the Nazi euthanasia program, which took place in the precursors to the extermination camps, which were literally called research hospitals. When it comes to transporting Jews, we all know about the cattle cars. Well, the cattle cars were simply an upscaled version of the grey buses that the Nazis used to transport persons with a disability to the research hospitals. And these grey buses had their windows painted so people on the outside couldn't see in and people on the inside couldn't see out. In other words, it was a way of concealing a mass transportation of people that were going to be subjected to genocide. And so comparing the cattle cars to the grey buses, it's an evolution. It clearly is. Then you have the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. People might not have heard of the law, but they'll be aware of the Jews that were sterilized in concentration camps. Well, that law is the reason that they were sterilized. And that law was originally passed in 1933 and enacted in 1934. It was one of Hitler's first laws, actually. And it specifically targeted persons with a disability or a mental illness. And in fact, in 1934, the Nazis mass sterilized and subjected to forced abortions hundreds of thousands of people with a disability or mental illness, or people believed to be carrying a child with either a disability or a mental illness. And in fact, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring was one of the two legal pillars of the Nuremberg laws, the other being the law against habitual criminals that literally equated disability with criminality. Um, and then you've got things like, for example, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, which was the main think tank for the final solution, which got that role in 1935, was originally given that role back in 1927 sorry, correction, it was given the role in 1927 when it was established of wiping out people with a disability. Um, it basically being the think tank for the Nazi euthanasia program. So just to clear that up, because it was a bit of gobbledygook there, it was established in 1927. Its sole role at that time was wiping out persons with a disability, and then in 1935, that role got expanded to wiping out Jews and others deemed to be undesirables. Now, the Nazi euthanasia program had two basic ideological pillars, and these are going to be very important for reasons that we'll see, and this is going to be a long video, but it's dense, it has to be. Um, so the two arguments the Nazis used to justify the Nazi euthanasia program were the notion of killing as a kindness. In other words, it's compassionate and kind to butcher people with a disability, even when you're brutally experimenting on them like complete sadists. Let that sink in for a minute. And the other is the notion that we were deemed to be, quote unquote, useless eaters. And what useless eaters means is that our mere existence is deemed to be so oppressive, parasitic, and burdensome that it justifies subjecting us to violence, abuse, and murder. So yeah, really lovely stuff. And of course, the Nazis were then very easily able to take that notion of, well, if you've got someone who you can deem to be undesirable and do this to them, then we can then use that precedent to then do that to anyone else we deem to be undesirable, which is incidentally why the Nazis were able to brutally mass murder Jews with such efficiency. They had literally spent the past 8 years in lock and step compared to the final solution, doing what they would later do to the Jews to people with a disability like me first. Now, people might say, yeah, that was, almost 80 years ago. Yeah, but history rhymes or repeats. I hate to say it, but never again has been a hypocritical joke, especially when it comes to those of us with a disability. When it comes to those of us with a disability, we have been subjected to mandatory sterilization long past 1945 with the Nazis. And then, of course, you get people trying to pass it back into fashion. In 2010, for example, the West Australian Mental Health Advisory Board put up a public bill or law for public consultation. That law was advocating for the mandatory sterilization, electroshock therapy, psychosurgery measures banned in Northern Territory and New South Wales, and indefinite detention of persons with a mental illness as young as 12 without parental knowledge or consent, and on the say-so of a responsible adult. Fun fact about the child euthanasia proportion of the Nazi euthanasia program. The Nazis literally did it without parental knowledge or consent on the say-so of a responsible adult. They'd literally tell the parents, oh, your kid's going in for a treatment. That treatment, by the way, which included and started with doing it to kids under the age of 3, was to put them in hospital wards and slowly, torturously murder them through starvation and exposure. Yeah, literally starving and exposing 2-year-olds to death, or even 1-year-olds. That's how sick and twisted this was. Of course, they don't have to push sterilization that much, because thanks to the pro-abortion lobby, who are literally closeted Nazis, and yes, I am saying you are literally guilty of inciting a repeat of the Holocaust and practicing part of it if you support that, they don't need to. So here's the thing about widespread abortion. One of the practices in that is literally pre-screening unborn kids for disabilities and then murdering them in utero because of it. Now, the two arguments that are used to justify this are, would you want to live if you were like that, which is just a thinly veiled version of the killing as a kindness argument, and the argument of, oh, they're a burden on the mother, which is essentially a thinly veiled version of the useless eaters argument. And so essentially what you have is a practice that only differs from what the Nazis did to people with a disability like me in 1934, in the sense that it is basically driven by a hateful mob as opposed to being driven by a fascist government supported by a hateful mob. So in other words, there is no real difference. So if you support pre-screening and aborting people with a disability like me, You are literally a Nazi. Okay? Your position is quite literally no different to if you were literally using Nazi rhetoric against Jews to incite, enable, and excuse violence against Jews. And I mean widespread rounding up and mass murder of Jews. That's the scale we're talking about here. And on top of that, and this is of course the way it works because it's all the slippery slope. When you have a situation where you have that much hatred for those of us with a disability before we're even born, you can't be surprised then that the vast majority of those of us with a disability face child abuse. And I'll add that for reasons that will become clear very shortly, that the vast majority of those with a duty of care to us are women. Pardon me. We're also in a society where we are at least 3 times as likely to be physically or sexually assaulted than someone without a disability, and we suffer domestic violence at some of the highest rates in the country. That is to say nothing of the fact that, as the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare noted in 2007, and I haven't seen it covered ever since, maybe because they wanted to keep it hush-hush for some reason, they noted then that those of us with a significant disability have a 42% risk of being suicidal and an 18% risk of attempting suicide at least once. In other words, roughly 1 in 5 of those of us with a significant disability will try to off ourselves. That's how serious it is. And on top of that, for reasons that will become clear later on, we also live in a society where, if you look at the Australian Human Rights Commission's discrimination complaint data for 2019 to 2020, and this is in their annual report covering it, by the way, you will note that 44% of all complaints were disability discrimination, 21% were sex discrimination, and 17% were race discrimination. So in other words, for reasons that will become clear later, ableism in this country is twice as serious than sexism, at least 2.5 times as serious as racism, and it's more serious than sexism and racism combined. In other words, if I were to put it in Marxist terms, you could look at that data and say that disabled white males are more oppressed than able-bodied women of color, and disabled women of color are far more likely to be oppressed due to ableism than they are due to racism or sexism. Intersectional feminists stick that one up your asses. Oh, and don't worry, I'm coming more for you later on. In fact, let's go there right now. See, the thing about feminism, since at least the 1970s, since at least second-wave feminism, is that its political and financial oxygen has been patriarchal dominance theory. Now, patriarchal dominance theory is simply patriarchal theory, you know, the notion that we live in a society of male power that subjugates and oppresses all women. It's that, taken it to its natural conclusions and applied to every single instance of abuse that ever has happened or ever will happen. In other words, it argues that all abuse is a manifestation of patriarchal dominance, or in general terms, that all abuse is a manifestation of the oppression of women and the product of male power, where women and girls can only be victims and only men and boys can be perpetrators. Now, I'll take a halfway step and just simply deal with female on male abuse, be it child abuse, child sexual abuse, rape, or domestic violence in this. The only way that patriarchal dominance theory can respond to female on male abuse is by arguing that the victim oppressed their abusers into abusing them. That's literally the argument of a domestic violence abuser, a rapist, a pedophile, and a child beater, as well as a child psychological abuser. But of course, those of us with a disability, generally, if you look at everything, I think you could reasonably say, lack the power or agency to reasonably be able to oppress anyone. So the only way that position can maintain its internal consistency is by shifting the goalposts from active oppression to passive oppression. In other words, arguing that our mere existence is inherently oppressive enough that it justifies subjecting us to violence and abuse. In other words, it argues that our mere existence oppressed our abusers into abusing us. Not only is that the argument of a domestic violence abuser, a rapist, a child molester, a child beater, and a child psychological abuser, it is quite literally the thinly veiled, useless eater's argument of a Nazi. Yes, feminists, I am saying by way of your ableism. Every one of you are Nazis, and if you don't like it, I have 4 words for you. If the jackboot fits. Because here is the reality. The reality is you have created a system where those of us who are disabled DV victims are going to be treated like perpetrators. You have created a system where those of us who are disabled rape victims who try to seek help are going to be manipulated after having our disclosures cherry-picked and then try to be talked into attending a sex offender program. You've created a system where when we're suicidal and we've got loved ones begging us to seek help because they're worried we're going to off ourselves or seriously harm ourselves, where we're going to be arbitrarily screened to see if we're a danger to others and then told to piss off when it's established we're not. And then when we try to do something, we'll be stonewalled. And all of these things are solely to do with the gender of us and the gender of our abusers. Oh, and before you start spouting statistics, that is a numerical framing device. That is using a disingenuous argument to shift the goalposts and gaslight. And in fact, it's interesting because there was a numerical framing device the Nazis used to justify the Nazi euthanasia program and the final solution. They would argue with these maths problems that German school children were given how much the state saved by offing X number of undesirables. And the reality is that when you argue on statistics, when in fact one victim is too many and one abuser is too many, those are the only numbers that matter, you psychopaths. When you argue on those grounds, you are arguing how many abused women who are abused by men can the state help by treating those of us who are disabled victims of abuse, including child abuse, like a bunch of useless eaters, or uppity R words, or uppity S words, who had it coming to us simply because we exist. And that is exactly what every single feminist is guilty of. And for any feminist who doesn't like it, for any leftist identitarian who doesn't like it, stop able-splaining, check your able-bodied privilege, shut up, listen, educate yourself, and become part of the solution. Because if there is a special place in hell for Hitler, I've got news for you. You're joining him at the rate you're going. Because that is literally what you are, a Nazi. So much so that if this were the 1940s, people like you would be forcing people like me into the gas chambers at Hadamar at gunpoint. Because you are literally a Nazi. Literally. This isn't soup Nazi, Godwin's law invoking territory. This is, you may as well be calling for the mass murder of Jews Nazi territory. Literally. Oh, and for anyone who wants to invoke Godwin's law, I'll note that Godwin himself said in an interview with Juicy, I think it was back in 2008, that the purpose of Godwin's law has always been educational. He wanted people who thought glibly about the Holocaust to think more deeply about it, because he was saying that the Holocaust is serious and it should never happen again. Well, guess what? If you're a feminist and you support patriarchal dominance theory, then guess what? You are making the Holocaust happen again. You are literally saying that it is acceptable to treat those of us with a disability, including children, like useless eaters in order to excuse, enable, and incite violence and abuse against us. That literally makes you no better than Hitler and Mengele. Literally. And it is not okay. We are in the middle of a disability royal commission. For Americans watching this, think a grand jury or a presidential commission. That's the US equivalent of a royal commission in Australia. That's literally where we're at, trying to deal with this. Yet, we have intersectional feminists that will on one hand argue that our abuse is deserved because we oppressed our abusers into abusing us, and if we dare say something about it, then we're treated as predatory, which simply reinforces the useless eaters argument, by the way, because it's simply saying that our mere existence is so oppressive that it justifies abuse and violence against us. And then you've got them pushing this straight white male privilege BS that argues that it's just white male privilege backfiring. And don't tell me it doesn't happen, okay? I have been publicly howled down with some nasty psychopathic feminist of color howling me down with, "You're a white guy! You're a white guy!" While they smirked. I've been told disabled white males cannot be oppressed because they do not benefit from whiteness and misogyny in the same way that disabled women of color do, even though that ableism is twice as bad as sexism and 2.5 times as bad as racism in this country. I've been told, even in a disability support group run by a radical feminist, I'll add, that I get you feel angry as someone with a disability, but if you're a white male, you'll never be as far behind as a female. So, yeah. The reality is that the left, when it comes to ableism and it comes to Nazis, are a glaring example of horseshoe theory. They have pushed so far to the left that they have literally met up with the alt-right. They literally support the notion that those of us with a disability deserve to be abused, assaulted, and murdered simply for existing, just like the alt-right does. The difference is the alt-right don't lie about it, and they don't pretend to hug us while stabbing us in the back with their two-faced forked tongues. You know, I find it hilarious that we get all this thing about, International Day of Disabilities, while the UN literally pushes patriarchal dominance theory, which is thinly veiled Nazism. I find it hilarious that the same people who try to talk about disability rights dismiss ableism as just white male privilege when the victim happens to be white and male. It reminds me of Cruel Intentions. I don't know who's seen Cruel Intentions. Brilliant movie, by the way. Absolutely great movie from the 2000s. Modern retelling of Dangerous Liaisons. Quite well done. But I'm reminded of Bunny Caldwell in that scene. I don't know who's watched it, but um, Selma, I'm trying to remember who it is. Is it Selma Blair that was in Cruel Intentions and in Legally Blonde with Reese Witherspoon and was in Hellboy? Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Well, she was in love with her music teacher who was black, well off, went to Juilliard, etc. Her mother, played by Christine Baranski, Bunny Caldwell, was an absolute racist, and one of the nice racists, the kind that would never actually use the N-word, but they think that makes it okay for them to view people of color as crap. When she was called out on her racism, she goes, "Don't give me any of that racist crap. My husband and I gave money to Colin Powell." Well, that's kind of what the left and feminists are like. They talk about equality. They talk about inclusivity, tolerance, etc. Not when you have a disability. When you have a disability, all that matters is your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. Because depending on that, you're either a political pawn to be used and exploited and discarded, or you're a living heresy to be burned at the stake. Or, as I would put it crudely, an uppity R word or uppity S word that needs to check their privilege and know their place and shut the hell up. It's not good enough. The reality is that never again means never again. There's a reason why the Nazis were able to butcher the Jews. There's a reason why racism, modern racism being based on eugenics, is so prevalent and has such a foothold in society. That reason is that the base form of eugenics is ableism. It always has been. And when you allow ableism, you are allowing eugenics and you are creating space for white supremacism and other forms of ethno-nationalism and ethno-tribalism. When you create space for ableism, and when you support it, you are creating space for eugenics, which means you're also enabling neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Not cool, not okay. The reality is that never again means never again. The reality is that if you are excusing and enabling and inciting violence and abuse against those of us who are members of Holocaust victim groups using Nazi Holocaust inciting rhetoric, you are a Nazi regardless of which side of the political divide you fall on. Never again means never again. Now, I could be nasty and say that every single feminist and member of the left who supports this should burn in hell and wish it on them. But I'm not going to hate because they don't deserve it. They make me angry. What they do is incredibly hurtful, just the same as when institutionalized racism in the 1940s in the US was so widespread. It was incredibly hurtful and angering to persons of color. But I'm going to be better than them. Because hate simply breeds more hate. So I'm just going to simply hope that they get an epiphany. And I know this video's gone on for over 20 minutes. It's a long one. But it was a dense one, and it had to be said. And I'm not going to apologize for that. The reality is that disabled lives matter. They matter. Disabled lives matter just as much as black lives matter. They matter just as much as women's lives matter. They matter just as much as LGBTIQ+ lives matter. The reality is that never again means never again. Either you accept that and support it, or you need an epiphany and you need to become part of the solution. Until next time, folks, be kind to each other. You deserve it.